you so much, Chelsea. I'm so thrilled to be here. I couldn't think of a more appropriate venue to talk about folk music revival than Caffe Vivaldi. During grad school, I used to come here and study and look over my notes and do some writing. So, in fact, this project, in part, originated at this very location. So, it has sentimental value for me as well. And as Chelsea said, I curated the exhibition Folk City, which closed back in January, and was the principal author of the accompanying book, and called Folk City. And the whole objective of Folk City, what really preoccupied me, inspired me, motivated me to curate the exhibition and do the book was, why did New York City become the epicenter of the folk music revival in the 50s and 60s? At first glance, it was a paradox to me. Folk music, largely rural and traditional in background, flourishing in the urban and modern milieu that was mid-20th century New York. How did that happen? And to answer that question, I focus in the book and in the exhibition on the significance of the city's progressive political climate that attracted folk singers from all over the nation. Many of them were politically active. I also focused on New York as the site of the center of the music industry, the business side of the industry, where the record labels were, where performance venues were, in this very neighborhood, of course. Journalists wrote about it through the New York Times, from Sing Out magazine, from Broadside, managers, agents, a whole network, a whole commercial infrastructure is here of New York as a place of production and distribution of folk music. So, you know, these were a couple of the few key reasons that I really zoned in on the city. And to be sure, you know, there were folk music was enjoyed nationwide from the late 50s to the mid-60s, this period of the commercial boom of the revival. Again, throughout the nation, especially in cities and college towns, but New York the epicenter of it. So we'll talk about why that was. The image that I begin with, Folk City, does anybody recognize this? Yeah, a bunch of you do. This is from the exterior of the original Gertie's Folk City, which was arguably the premier folk music venue, founded in 1960 by Mike Porco. It was originally on West 4th and Mercer Street, but then relocated in 1970 to West 3rd, just off of 6th Avenue. Closed in 1987, and I'm in touch with the grandson of the owner, is Bob Porco, and Bob worked with me on the exhibition, and he said, you know what, the original sign of Gertie's Folk City was given to the bartender when it closed in the late 80s, and it's been in her garage since the late 80s. And so I contacted her, he gave me the contact information, we featured it in the show. It was one of our great objects, so I was very pleased to feature it prominently. Now, the story, although we focus on the 50s and 60s, I go back to the 1930s, tracing the roots of the folk music revival. Why the 1930s? Because this was a time period when, during the Great Depression, when many folklorists were traveling the nation recording traditional songs. There was a real sense of urgency. Rural culture is in decline. The United States is becoming an increasingly an urban industrial society. This music is rapidly fading away as radio becomes more popular, as mass culture becomes more homogeneous. You know, we're sort of losing our regional traditions, and many folklorists were going around with this sense of urgency, especially father and son John and Ellen Lomax, who worked for the Library of Congress from around 1934 to 1942. They traveled, they went to 33 states, they went to the West Indies. You know, they were funded in part by the Carnegie Corporation, by the Rockefeller Foundation. They brought the latest recording equipment with them, and they were going to regions like the Mississippi Delta, the Piedmont region of the Carolinas, the Texas Hill Country, the Great Lakes region, the Western Plains, recording ultimately about 10,000 songs. You know, they traveled to relatively isolated areas with this modern recording equipment, collecting songs from cotton plantations, from cowboy ranches, lumber camps, segregated penitentiaries, songs by miners, by lumbermen, by sailors, soldiers, railroad men, hobos, convicts, making the point that this is part of our cultural heritage, this music. And we need to document it, we need to chronicle it, we need to record it and preserve it for the Library of Congress for future generations. And it gives us insight into who we are as Americans, into our multiracial, multi-ethnic heritage. Previous folklorists, I think, really concentrated on Anglo-Saxon Protestant songs in Appalachia, like Cecil Sharp, for example. But they said, you know, they kind of expanded the focus and said that, yes, Mexican girls singing songs in San Antonio are part of the broader American culture. Convicts singing in Chain Gang in South Carolina in 1934. So they're also challenging traditional notions of culture associated, you know, capital C culture, associated with the symphonic orchestra, with fine arts, with classical music. But no, these are part of our customs. These songs that have been transmitted orally for many, many generations, and it's incumbent upon us to record them and to preserve them. And many of these 10,000 songs recorded in the 30s and early 40s would become really source material for the folk music revival when it flourished nationwide in the 50s and 60s. Another reason I go back to the 30s, the Great Depression era, is because this is a time period when many folk singers were moving to New York City from different parts of the country. Some famous, you know, Woody Guthrie, right? The Dust Bowl troubadour from Okemah, Oklahoma. He also lived in Pampa, Texas. Arrived in New York in 1940, Woody Guthrie was multifaceted, was rootless, a singer, a poet, playful balladeer, a rugged individualist. You know, he wrote many songs, of course, about Okies and Arkies, migrant workers uprooted by the Dust Bowl, which struck the Great Plains region in the middle of the 1930s, including his own family. Many of them, of course, lost their farms, went out west to California seeking employment in the agricultural sector of California's economy, often disillusioned there. And you know that John Steinbeck, of course, documented the plight too in The Grapes of Wrath. Woody's Dust Bowl ballads similarly really express a sense of empathy with these Okies who were devastated by this severe drought. Really documented their hardships, celebrated the dignity of their labor, spoke out for them when injustices occurred, whether by unscrupulous bosses, exploitative bankers. An image of Woody in the city in 1943 was a promotional image for his autobiography, which was actually a blend of fact and fiction called Bound for Glory. So I think it's a really terrific image. Woody Guthrie would become, of course, a seminal figure in the folk revival. Not long after he arrived in 1940, he wrote This Land Is Your Land in the Hanover House on 43rd Street and 6th Avenue, a rebuttal to God Bless America by Irving Berlin, which was really popularized by Kate Smith. He heard the song and said, it was played incessantly on the radio, said, this does not resonate with me. It's not about my own people. I can't relate to the song, so This Land Is Your Land is sort of a response to that version of God Bless America. So many others, I won't mention them all, but Hootie Leadbelly Ledbetter, known as Leadbelly, from Louisiana. He was, quote, discovered by the Lomaxes during their field recording trips in 1933, 1934. As I said, the Lomaxes often went to segregated penitentiaries to record convicts singing in chain gangs. Why did they go there? Well, they thought that this music, you know, they were relatively isolated from the rest of modern society. These songs were more pure, quote unquote. They hadn't been corrupted by the radio, by mass culture. So they were keen on going to penitentiaries. And they went to the notorious Angola prison in Louisiana, 33, and, quote, discovered Leadbelly, whose repertoire was extensive. They were astonished. Leadbelly knew hundreds of songs, blues, spirituals, cowboy songs, traditional ballads, had this resonant voice, this commanding style, and a 12-string guitar. You know, his repertoire again was vast. He didn't write most of the songs, but he had a terrific memory. He, you know, traveled a lot throughout Louisiana, Texas, Mississippi, these states. Earlier in the 20th century, absorbed these songs, and if not for him, we probably wouldn't know songs like Goodnight Irene, Midnight Special, Rock Island Mine, songs that he later taught to so many others, people like Pete Seeger and others. He was released in prison in 1934, pardoned by the governor of Louisiana. John Lomax brought him to New York in early '35. Here he is playing the Village Vanguard. Again, not too far from where we are. You know who that is in the back right? Another important singer is from South Carolina and came to New York by way of Chicago, is Josh White. Helped introduce urban audiences to blues music, to protest songs, to gospel music. So another important figure, Josh White. They're performing at the Village Vanguard. Other places that folk singers performed during this period was included Café Society in Greenwich Village, which was located in Sheridan Square, since closed. So again, the performance. And I do want to stress, you know, they weren't making much money during this period, the 30s and 40s. Folk music was on the margins during this era. And who was popular in the 30s at this time in terms of musicians, singers? Crooners like Bing Crosby. So again, they're on the margins. They're mostly playing small clubs appreciated by leftist audiences in New York City during the Great Depression. Now, the point that I want to stress with this particular slide, towards the end of the Great Depression, the political left in New York embraces folk music. And this was not inevitable. The political left, the Communist Party, the Socialist Party, eager to use art to advance their political ideas, at first reject folk music. Why? Well, according to Charles Seeger, father of Pete Seeger, folk music's too passive, it's melancholy, it's defeatist, this is hardly the fuel of a workers' revolution. But by the end of the decade, there's an increasing appreciation of the culture of common men. You know, common folk, their songs, their legends, their myths, their stories. So we need to probe this music like the Lomaxes were and discover perhaps radical potential in some of the songs. And so we see this increasing connection between the left and indigenous vernacular traditional music in the late 30s. And it's embodied in a couple of important concerts that occurred in New York City that I read about in the book. From Spirituals to Swing, 1938 at Carnegie Hall by producer and jazz writer John Hammond, better known at Columbia Records. He signed Dylan in '61, but was a civil rights activist. The concert in honor of the recently deceased Bessie Smith was basically a celebration of African American culture and music going back a couple of centuries or so. And Hammond aimed to illustrate the rich history of black music to combat racist stereotypes about the impoverishment of African American culture. And the concert featured gospel, blues, early New Orleans, jazz, boogie-woogie music, swing music, you know, and he brought an impressive cast of musicians to the city. People like Sonny Terry, Brownie McGee, Big Bill Brunzi, and we start to associate New York with important causes that combat racism, that advance progressive politics, where we can bring talent from all over the country. It's an integrated audience in Carnegie Hall, 1938. That speaks volumes. 1940, the Grapes of Wrath fundraiser, just a month after Woody arrived. Woody arrived in February 40. Grapes of Wrath, obviously a reference to the Steinbeck novel. John Ford did a film. You've seen the film, Grapes of Wrath. So to raise money for displaced agricultural workers, I mean, what a lineup. Will Geer was an activist and actor. He's the one who encouraged Woody Guthrie to come to New York. Woody had been in California. Alan Lomax, the folklorist, and Molly Jackson from Kentucky, the voice of Appalachian labor, Leadbelly, Guthrie, and so many others. What's important about this particular concert, Pete Seeger played. A Harvard dropout, Pete Seeger, New England background, patrician family, son of Charles Seeger, musicologist, came to New York to become a journalist, learning the banjo, played a couple of songs. One of his first performances, the Grapes of Wrath concert in 1940, didn't do well, got some polite applause from the audience. Who stole the show was Woody Guthrie, on stage imparting his oaky wisdom in these dry monologues, and the audience was just absolutely captivated, and so was Pete Seeger. He said, I need to get to know this guy. This guy just has a vast repertoire, and although they had really different personalities, they became close friends and collaborators. Woody, in some ways a mentor to Pete, both titanic figures, seminal figures of the folk revival. And later on, Alan Lomax said, you can date the renaissance of American folk music to that concert in New York in March 1940 when Pete met Woody for the first time. So a really tremendous event. Now the Almanac Singers, including Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger, also Millard Lampell, Bess Lomax, Alan's sister Arthur Stern, Sis Cunningham from Oklahoma on accordion, based here in Greenwich Village on West 10th Street from 1941 to 1943, the first modern urban folk music group. They lived in the Almanac House. It was a loose, collective, informal. Members came and went. You know, they lived communally in this loft. They played Southern Methodist hymns, blues, mountain ballads, but above all, labor music, anti-fascist in their political orientation. This is the early 40s, during World War II. In fact, they were sympathetic to the Soviet Union. Often their music reflected geopolitical trends. So first they were anti-war when the Soviet Union was not in war, but then when Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 41, they began to sing pro-war music as the Red Army mobilized. Didn't sell many records, but critical, you know, in kind of, you know, in introducing New York audiences to new folk music. And, you know, many of the members, of course, would go on and flourish in other capacities. So the Almanac Singers from 1941 to 43, they disbanded because many members joined the war effort or left and worked on war initiatives in Detroit. After World War II, we see an expansion of folk music culture in New York City, in this neck of the woods, Greenwich Village. The Weavers, this quartet, Ronnie Gilbert, Pete Seeger, Lee Hayes, who had also been a member of the Almanac Singers, and Fred Hellerman on guitar, formed in 48. At first, they were resistant to play in nightclubs. And you might be wondering, well, why? What do you mean? Because that meant becoming polished, slick singers, appealing to broader audiences. They considered themselves respectful practitioners of folk music, and they didn't want to dilute the music to appeal to larger audiences. They had been playing in like union halls and auditoriums, labor rallies, but they overcame that resistance, and they started to play places like the Village Vanguard in 49, and they got a lot of attention. So much that they were able to get a contract with Decca Records. And that was a major coup at that time. Decca was a prominent national label. They had people like the Petrus sisters, Frank Sinatra, Burl Ives in their stable, promoted by the band leader Gordon Jenkins, the Weavers, and scored many major hits. You know, they had catchy renditions of traditional folk songs, appealing to large audiences. Their big hit in 1950 was Goodnight Irene. Leadbelly had died in 49. 6 months later, the song associated with him, Goodnight Irene, becomes a major hit. Topped the charts. You couldn't turn on the radio in 1950 without hearing Goodnight Irene. So they really achieved stardom and showed the potential for commercial success of folk music after World War II, the late 40s, early 50s. However, what's also happening in the political realm at this time? The Red Scare. And Pete Seeger had been a member of the Communist Party in the 1940s, a nominal member. He wasn't a hardcore ideologue, but a small C communist, as I describe him in the book. But nevertheless, he was, and during this period of backlash against the left in the early 50s, the McCarthy era, publications like Red Channels came out. June 1950, this right-wing tract which reported, if you can't see it, the communist influence in radio and television. During this purge, there was a real significant concern about people in entertainment. The Hollywood 10, right? The notion is these screenwriters, actors, musicians, they all have a disproportionate influence in society. They can mold the ideas of people in the audience, as if people in crowds were easily manipulated and duped. So I think that's kind of interesting about this whole frenzy. But this lists people with alleged leftist ties in the 50s and the 40s. And it wasn't just Pete Seeger, but Josh White, Paul Robeson, Earl Robinson, Alan Lomax, WNYC radio show host Oscar Brand, Richard Dyer Bennett, Burl Ives. All prominent singers in the New York folk music community. Their careers were derailed, and they changed courses. Pete, refused to testify when he was called in front of Congress, HUAC, in 55. He was convicted. Ultimately, he was indicted in 57, convicted in 61 for refusal to cooperate with Congress. He did not plead the Fifth Amendment. He said, "This is my First Amendment right. I've got a freedom of beliefs and speech." And ultimately, his conviction was overturned in 1962. It became a sort of a cause célèbre, but it further linked folk music to leftist politics. And as a result, the Weavers disbanded by 53. They lost their Decca contract. They lost radio time. Concerts were canceled. They would reunite to great fanfare in 1955, and continued on in different phases until around 1980 or so. But we get a real sense of the one hand of the potential for success for folk music, but also the potent political paranoia in the country in the early 50s. Also, why New York? Because there were so many labels that flourished here in the late 40s, early 50s that were established here. I'm thinking Elektra, formed by Jack Holtzman, Orrin Keepnude, Riverside Records. Above all in significance was Folkways Records, established by Mo Ash in 1948. And like the Lomaxes, Mo Ash was very eclectic and inclusive, like an anthropologist. He was interested in recording and disseminating music from all over the world. He didn't have a hierarchical view of culture or of music. He wasn't interested in releasing hit records, but in fact, kind of chronicling the sounds of the world, to use his term. And when I was doing research at the Smithsonian, I found this bulletin, Folkways Records releasing the music of Yugoslavia, Honduras, and Haiti in the early 50s, before we even heard the term world music. So it's really quite remarkable, and he was a real champion of new trends emerging, very egalitarian, a key figure in the folk revival, Mo Ash. Other organizations, Sing Out magazine, founded in 1950 by Irwin Silver, also from the old left of the 1930s, associated with leftist labor movements. Pete Seeger, Alan Lomax were also co-founders. Really a very important magazine, and the whole idea was that folk music, according to Irwin Silver, could raise people's awareness. It could bring people together. It had this potential to enhance your sensibilities and maybe, create progressive change in society. That's why I quote it. For those of you in the back who maybe can't read it, from an Irwin Silver editorial, the political folk song belongs to all of us. And maybe if more of us exercise our right in using it and developing it, we would be helping to make America a better place to live. So you get a sense of the real justification, the faith in the potential of music to change society, embodied in Sing Out. He was very provocative, wrote editorials to stir up debate. You know, the Weavers, they're playing African-American music, but they don't have any African-Americans in the group. Bob Dylan going electric in 1965, abandoning political folk songs. He's becoming a narcissist and self-absorbed. So he would write these provocative editorials and Sing Out that really stirred up debate about the role of music in society at large. Izzy Young's Folklore Center, not too far from here, right? Originally on 110 McDougal Street, another key figure in this revival of interest in folk music in New York City. Opened the shop in 1957. Yes, sold books, records, instruments, but more than that, it wasn't simply a shop, but it was a place he promoted concerts. He wrote a column for Sing Out. He introduced folk singers to each other. You just arrived in the city from Texas, you from California, maybe you want to meet each other, maybe I can help you get a gig at one of the performance venues located nearby. To use a common term, he was able to network in a sophisticated fashion. He was loud, obnoxious, lovable. Izzy knew everybody. He posted notices about folk music happening. So it was a place to socialize, hang out in the store. Sometimes there were impromptu performances in the Folklore Center. And many shops similar to the Folklore Center opened up nationwide and kind of used it as a model. So once again, we see like New York as sort of like an incubator of trends in the Village in particular. Now the question, why does folk music really begin to resonate deeply nationwide in the late 1950s? I mean, what other forms of culture, entertainment were available to Americans in the late 1950s? And in fact, I argue in the book that mass culture, and I don't take it too far, but you know, it was, as many critics charged back then, you know, often considered to be tasteless, mindless, encouraged conformity. It was banal, it was trite, and I picked out a couple of images kind of suggesting these attributes. Mass culture, hit songs, radio serials, Pulp Fiction, television sitcoms, Hollywood movies. You know, after the McCarthy era, not as staring, not as provocative as it had been perhaps in the 1930s. During a more progressive era. By contrast, folk music, you know, and music in the 50s, in the late 50s. We know rock and roll, you know, surged in popularity in the mid-50s with Elvis, Chuck Berry, Bill Haley and the Comets, Fats Domino, and others. By the late 50s, though, it declined, I believe. Elvis joined the Army. There were numerous scandals engulfing rock and roll in the late 50s. A lot of the songs appealing to teenagers, kind of superficial bubblegum lyrics, kind of, you know, me and my baby, moon and June, baby, I love you, you know, not too much beneath the surface there. Whereas folk music, by contrast, was about work, it was about play, it was about love, it was about death, loss, deprivation, misfortune, amusement. You know, the reality of people's lives, it had a depth of meaning, and it's attracting people mostly liberal, middle class, at the end of the Eisenhower era, the beginning of the Kennedy era. You know, it had an edge to it too. Pete Seeger was a convicted felon. Leadbelly had been arrested for murder. Woody Guthrie was a rootless Dust Bowl troubadour. So there was a certain edge that people are gravitating to, similar to, say, the beat poets and novelists like Kerouac and Ginsberg had an edge during the late Eisenhower era, as was the case with folk music. And here it's going to be the focal point of the revival in New York, of course, was Greenwich Village. And the heart of it, arguably, was Washington Square. Sunday afternoon, you could, you know, bring your guitar, your banjo, your mandolin, your auto harp down to the square. You needed a permit to play. You would get that from the Parks Commissioner. You know, play from 2 to 5 in the afternoon on a warm afternoon from spring to fall, when the weather's nice, and meet like-minded individuals. And there's a communal effect, as this image suggests. People getting to know each other. you know, breaking down barriers. In the anonymous city, it's often hard to meet people. But here's one place where it was relatively easy to meet people. And you weren't just going there to sing and play, but to maybe find a dating partner, just enjoy the afternoon with friends. The village had a cachet to it. It was a cool place to hang out. And this was strictly non-professional, amateurs. And it became so popular that, in fact, it was banned by the Parks Commissioner. I was just on a podcast about a week ago about this incident. In 1961, Parks Commissioner Newell Morris banned it. He said, look, the folk singers are attracting these hordes of people to Greenwich Village on Sunday afternoon. They're taxing the park's resources. You know, they're bothersome, they're antisocial, and used the pejorative term, they're beatniks. You know, which indeed was a pejorative term back then, right? It suggests sort of people who are lazy, you know, dress a certain way, talk a certain way, and you know, not your typical respectable middle-class individuals. Banned it, and guess what? The folk singers protested. They clashed with police. It wasn't a riot, as the tabloids screamed the next day. Yeah, but there was some pushing and shoving between folk singers and the cops. April 9th, 1961. Protests for 6 more weeks. Finally, Mayor Robert Wagner realized, this is so ridiculous. We're going to repeal the ban, let the folk singers back into the park. You know, and he's running for re-election. He didn't want Greenwich Village to oppose him in 1961. So, but it's an interesting incident about the use of public space, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, the debates that took place. Why did folk music flourish in Greenwich Village? I mean, sometimes we just think it's inevitable looking back in our history, but I really stress the importance of the performance venues. This is from a map that I had in the exhibition. Each red dot indicates a performance venue right around where we are, of course. Baker Street, many concentrated on McDougal Street as well. And these weren't just simply places to play, but you know, these were important in many ways. Folk performance venues, and above all in importance were, I think, 4 of them. Gertie's Folk City, I mentioned earlier, the Village Gate, Gaslights, what am I forgetting? Village Gate, Gaslight, Gertie's Folk City, the Bitter Ends, still there on I think. You know, these in particular had significant cachet, but there were numerous. There were a couple dozen or so, and places where you, a folk singer, now in the late 50s, early 60s, could hone your skills. You could experiment with new material and make mistakes in front of sympathetic yet discerning audiences. You know, you could learn how to hold a crowd's attention in these performance venues, which were often small and intimate, like Caffe Vivaldi. You could maybe gain a following in certain venues. If you're lucky, maybe you'll encounter an agent or a manager in the audience. Perhaps if you're really lucky, Robert Shelton of the New York Times will review your performance, as he did for Bob Dylan on September 19, 1961, when he played Gertie's Folk City. Age of 20 gave him a rave review that really helped catapult Dylan to prominence in the fall of '61. So now we've got this boom in folk music in the late 50s, and once again, like the 30s, there's a real influx of folk singers to the city. Judy Collins from Colorado, Mark Spolstra from California, Tom Paxton from Oklahoma, Len Chandler and Phil Oakes from Ohio, Carolyn Hester from Texas, Patrick Skye from Georgia, Dylan from Minnesota, and I'm just mentioning some of the most famous ones, but of course hundreds of others who did not achieve fame but came here with talent and ambition and were bold and were really keen on developing their skills. You know, you can meet people, you see somebody on Thursday, they see you, you become friends, you know, you might see them perform a couple days later. There are rivalries developing too, rivalries between Oakes and Dylan, for example, kind of bringing out the best in you. Wow, did you hear them play that song? I mean, maybe I can do something similar. So, you know, there was a good spirit of competition there as well. In places like the Gaslight Cafe, which was located next to Izzy Young's shop on McDougal Street, basement subterranean, Gertie's Folk City, around the corner in West 4th and Mercer, the Bitter End, on Bleecker Street. Sometimes particular groups developed an association with a specific venue, the Bitter End. Who really developed there? Peter, Paul, and Mary, right? This trio formed by Albert Grossman, who was Dylan's manager. He saw that, you know, the Kingston Trio were a big hit in 1958, appealing to a nationwide audience. Albert Grossman says, well, maybe I can form a trio similar but different. Maybe we'll have a little gender balance. So it's Peter, Paul, and Mary. Mary Travers, Peter Yarrow, who wrote the foreword to the book, and Noel Paul Stuckey formed, and they really cut their teeth at the bitter end. Their first album became a major sensation. The Café Vivaldi around the corner on McDougal Street and Minetta Lane. And sometimes, you know, it wasn't just the performance venues. Like right above Gaslight was this bar called Kettle of Fish. And I interviewed a lot of people and had them write personal recollections in the book. And they said, you know what? That's sometimes where we got our best ideas. We just have a beer after our set at the Kettle of Fish, smoke a cigarette, you know, and we would just, you know, like there would be those ooh moments, you know, like writers often have, like, you know, you're just walking, like, oh, yeah, you know, and just in casual conversations. So, you know, the Village, it wasn't just where you performed, but where you hung out as well and socialized. You know, what also nurtured this was Broadside Magazine. Are you familiar with this? It formed in 1962 by Agnes Sis Cunningham and her husband Gordon Friesen. This was a mimeograph magazine, part of like this do-it-yourself culture, which was very much in contrast to mass culture. It was sort of like from the ground up. We're you know, publishing songs and mimeographing them and stapling together our magazines, distributing them. But these are an important outlet for young singer-songwriters. So what we're seeing in the Village in the early 60s, young singer-songwriters finding an outlet for their music, then being distributed. Especially Phil Oakes, topical songwriters in the early 60s, writing about what's happening in American politics and society and culture, whether it's an incident at the University of Mississippi during the Civil Rights Movement or the Cuban Missile Crisis. Phil was a topical singer-songwriter, would read the New York Times or Time magazine and then get his inspiration and then go write a song. So Broadside Magazine nurtured Phil Oakes, Dylan, Eric Anderson, Tom Paxton, and so many other young and emerging generation of singer-songwriters. And it was all becoming very popular. The peak era of the boom in terms of popularity, commercial sales, was 1963. And you couldn't, you know, basically turn on the TV without hearing the term hootenanny, which referred to this basic jam session. You know, Pete Seeger first heard the term at a CIO rally in Seattle in 1941. Kind of like raising money for a cause, a hootenanny, like a jam session, open mic, if you will. But now it's a term used by mass culture, corporate America, Madison Avenue, to promote and move goods. Hootenanny. And you get, you know, I've had a hootenanny blanket, a beach blanket that I featured in the exhibition. There was hootenanny hand lotion, hootenanny beach bags, hootenanny pinball machines, a Miss Hootenanny contest. There was a hootenanny show on ABC TV. You remember that? 1963-64, prime time. And it often took place on college campuses. These buttoned-down, nice-looking young folk singers, palatable to a large audience. Though it was controversial because they banned Pete Seeger, and there was a boycott of the show by other folk singers in response. This whole hootenanny craze, it really inflamed these debates about authenticity. It was something that was so valued, and it mattered greatly to the folk music community. Who is an authentic folk singer? It's a slippery term. What did authenticity mean? Well, it meant, you know, it involved your purpose, your personal style as a folk singer, how you performed on stage, your lyrical content, sometimes your regional background, your class background, your race. You know, Mississippi John Delta singing the blues, there was something authentic about him. Maybe not so much about the Chad Mitchell Trio, you know, the Brothers Four. There's a real, you know, the distinction. Like polished song, people who are exploiting the craze, versus, quote, the music of the people. And the left was furious about this. You know, they're taking the music of the people and they're exploiting it. So, you know, people with slick appearances, and you heard the same debates with hip-hop music, you know, we're keeping it real, he's a phony. You know, it often happens with music that comes, that ferments in the community and then becomes popular and increasingly commercial. This whole craze lasted about 1 year. Then what happened, and hootenanny craze faded by around 64, and why was that?
Beatles.
Yeah, right, there were these 4 lads who arrived from Liverpool called Paul, John, George, and Ringo, and the British invasion begins, right? So now we're going to shift the focus, the media, to the British invasion, the Beatles, the Stones, later on, you know, the Kinks and Zeppelin. So rock and roll is going to kind of re-emerge in a different context in the middle of the 60s, and we're going to see the blending of folk music and rock and what we call folk rock, right? The rise of folk rock, where now you have Dylan, who was embraced by the political left, you know, as a result of his songs Blowin' in the Wind, The Times They Are A-Changin', Masters of War, you know, who really captured the zeitgeist, the mood of the tumultuous 60s. His music stopped people in their tracks. Bob Dylan, performing for Columbia Records, but never embraced that title, spokesman of a generation, voice of the counterculture. He never wanted it, and he backs away from that, rejects it, in fact, by 64, 65, with another side of Bob Dylan, and then bringing it all back home at Highway 61 Revisited, semi-electric. His songs are much more introspective, like, or they reject, like Maggie's Farm. I ain't gonna work on Maggie's Farm no more. You know, I'm not your political protest singer anymore. So, you know, don't hold me to that. Instead, Mr. Tambourine Man is much more introspective, surreal in lyrics. People like to diagnose and analyze him. You know, created a stir when he went electric at the Newport Folk Festival, right? The preeminent folk music festival held annually in Newport, Rhode Island. Some people booed, some people cheered, maybe booed because the sound was bad or his set was short, but that incident became mythologized, but really emblematic of changes in the mid-1960s. Other changes, yeah, okay. Frozen. I concluded there was one more slide with the Lovin' Spoonful, who really embodied the, thank you. The rise of folk rock, who had roots in Greenwich Village. John Sebastian, right? Who formed the Lovin' Spoonful, had major hits with songs like Summer in the City, Do You Believe in Magic, roots in jug band music, blues, and blended folk and rock, and they moved out to the West Coast, and indeed there was a real shift, I argue in my conclusion, from New York to the West Coast. The Mamas and the Papas also had roots in the city. Again, the Lovin' Spoonful, the Byrds, folk rock based out in California. A new psychedelic scene emerging at this time in San Francisco, embodied by the Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane. Of course, folk music is going to continue well, you know, beyond the late 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I also conclude in the book with the Songwriters Exchange, by, you know, founded by Jack Hardy in 1977. This informal cooperative of musicians who would meet at his home in West Houston Street, exchange songs, later published those songs in Fast Folk magazine. People like Rod McDonald, Lucy Kaplansky, Suzanne Vega, Sean Colvin. Is Dave Massengill here? He will be here later. He really embodied that, so I'm really thrilled in particular. But we also have other musicians connected, like Bert right here, and you know, Eric will perform as well. So my point is that folk music, you know, continued, but it never reached the popularity that it had from around 1958 to 1965. So I will conclude with that, and you know, if you have any comments or questions, I'd be happy to take them before we shift to the musicians.